Good afternoon, social media. This is Rich again, back for your second video blog of the day for Wednesday, March 25th, 2015, around 4:27 p.m. in Billerica, Massachusetts. Sunny out today. Highs about 50 degrees. That's good. Getting more and more of the snow melting in these backyards and woods and stuff, which is pretty good. It's going to probably take until mid-April for all the snow to be gone in this area, which is good. Some news to report. MLB Network has announced it signed Baseball Hall of Fame pitcher Pedro Martinez to become an analyst for the studio shows. Pedro Martinez has been working TBS baseball programming for the past 2 years. And also, there's been a report that Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced that he wants to make a highway between the Bering Strait connecting Alaska to Russia as part of a superhighway that will go from New York City to London, England. You could drive there one of these days. The cost of the project will be $1 billion. Personally, I don't know if it's ever going to happen. And there's been a report that if the Bruins do not make the playoffs, which it's a possibility, that Claude Julien could get the axe. Personally, it's not Claude Julien's fault that the Bruins are playing poorly this year, subpar. The general manager, Peter Chiarelli's job should be on the line. He should be fired, Chiarelli. He's dismantled a good team in the Bruins. And that's about it on that. My next video subject of the day is about World-Class Championship Wrestling. World-Class Championship Wrestling was a regional territory in professional wrestling that lasted from 1966 through 1989, but its peak years were in the early 80s, and it was run by Fritz von Erich, and it was based out of Dallas, Texas. But World-Class Championship Wrestling was the vehicle of the Von Erich brothers, David, Kerry, Kevin, and Mike. And the territory was famous for the Freebirds versus Von Erich's feud, which was the best feud in professional wrestling history, in my opinion, that was not part of WWF or WWE or WCW. The background of World-Class Championship Wrestling, it started out in 1966 as big-time wrestling, run and owned by legendary wrestler Fritz von Erich, Fritz played a heel German sympathizer. He was a Nazi sympathizer as his character, and he was one of the biggest heels in professional wrestling history in the 50s and the 60s. Fritz von Erich was not from Germany at all. His real name was Jack Atkinson, who was born and raised in Texas. In fact, he played for the Southern Methodist University football team in the late 40s and stuff. He was a good football player, but he got kicked off the football team because of violations and stuff. And he tried to play in the NFL in the early 50s, but he didn't make it. So he went into the world of professional wrestling. And he became Fritz von Erich, the German Nazi sympathizer. He was pretty good as a heel, and he had 6 children: Jack Jr., Kevin, David, Kerry, Mike, and Chris. And all of his boys except one went into the world of professional wrestling, but only one of them survived past their 33rd birthday. That's Kevin. And anyway, for many years, Big Time Wrestling was like a regional promotion in Dallas, Texas. Fritz von Erich was a top star for many years there. He actually eventually became the hero there, the top face. But Fritz was getting up there in years. He wanted to go backstage to run the booking and the promoting and stuff. And he also affiliated Big Time Wrestling with the NWA, which was the top wrestling organization in the world. Fritz would have usually the NWA champion come to his shows that were at Dallas Sportatorium or the Fort Worth Civic Center and the Will Rogers Arena in Fort Worth, Texas and stuff. Big Time Wrestling was mainly a Dallas-based promotion, which did pretty good. And in the early 1980s, Fritz von Erich made a deal with the Christian Broadcasting Network, and he had to show Big Time Wrestling, but Big Time Wrestling was rebranded World Class Championship Wrestling, and it started in 1982 as World Class Championship Wrestling. Calling the action on World Class Championship Wrestling was Bill Mercer, who was a longtime Dallas sports announcer. Bill called Dallas Cowboys games for a few years on radio in the mid-60s. He was replaced by Vern Lundquist, who's famous for being CBS Sports, and he also Bill Mercer did some college sports for North Texas basketball and football, and he did Texas Rangers baseball. And also the ring announcer was Mark Lawrence, and they had a syndicated show which was part of the CBN that broadcast throughout the country, which included Fox 25 in Boston. And also World Class Championship Wrestling had like a local program on Channel 11 out of Dallas, Texas for many years, which Channel 11 back then was an independent station in Dallas, and it was kind of a super station that it went all across the West Coast, west of the Mississippi River, as far away as California and Oregon and Washington. So World Class Championship Wrestling had a good reach. The main stars of World Class Championship Wrestling were the Von Erichs, Kevin, Kerry, and David. Plus they had other talent like the Great Kabuki and Bill Irwin and Jose Lothario. King Kong Bundy wrestled for them for a time. They had managers Gary Hart and Scandal Akbar, Devastation Incorporated. And for the first few months, World Class Championship Wrestling territory was, just another regional territory, even though they got worldwide exposure, national exposure through syndication and stuff. Kerry, Kevin, and David were like the top draws in this territory, and they were feuding with the heels at the time in there, but none of them were super heels. But a fateful night happened in December 25th, 1982, which catapulted World Class Championship Wrestling as the hottest regional promotion in the world. It was a steel cage match between Kerry Von Erich and Nature Boy Ric Flair for the NWA World Title. And they had special referee Michael Hayes of the Freebirds, so they would call it down the middle. This was an awesome cage match, and Michael Hayes put Kerry on Ric Flair to cover him, but Kerry did not want to win by cheating. Michael Hayes was furious, and as Kerry starts walking through the door, Terry Bam Bam Gordy, who was securing the cage door, smashed on Kerry's face, and this started the famous Von Erichs versus Freebirds feud. The Freebirds were Michael P.S. Hayes, Terry Bam Bam Gordy, and Buddy Jack Roberts. And the Freebirds versus Von Erich feud was the most awesome feud. They always feuded over the World Class Championship Wrestling 6-man tag team titles, which the Sportatorium in Dallas, Texas was always sold out for Friday night cards. People would always see the Freebirds and Von Erichs. Also, they wrestled all across the territory, selling out a lot. And also, around this time, World Class Championship Wrestling got other good wrestlers like Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin with Sunshine. Eventually, he dumped Sunshine for Precious, his real-life right. Gentleman Chris Adams, Kamala, The Missing Link, Iceman King Parsons, The Fantastics, and many others. Once in a while, they had like Harley Race and Andre the Giant make occasional appearances at the Sportatorium. And the Freebirds feud with the Von Erichs was hot in 1983 and stuff. and world-class championship wrestling was going places all across the land. But on February 10th, 1984, tragically struck the Von Erich family. David Von Erich, who was wrestling on a tour of Japan, passed away at the age of 25 due to a stomach injury. There's been questions that David Von Erich was taking drugs. There's been an urban legend that Bruiser Brody, who was on the tour with David Von Erich, flushed down drugs into the toilet so the investigators wouldn't think it was drugs. And David Von Erich was slated for an NWA World title reign by beating he was scheduled to be the NWA World Champion by beating Nature Boy Rick Fliss in 1984 in Dallas, Texas Stadium. But he couldn't do it because he passed away, and they decided that Kerry Von Erich was going to beat Ric Flair for the NWA World title at Texas Stadium. It was called the Parade of Champions. It was the David Von Erich Memorial. It happened on May 6, 1984. It was an awesome supercard. Over 40,000 people fit Dallas, Texas Stadium. It was Kerry Von Erich beating Nature Boy Ric Flair with the black slide 1, 2, 3 to become the new NWA World Champion. Plus, they had the Von Erichs, Kevin Von Erich, Mike Von Erich, and Fritz Von Erich, who came out of retirement to beat the Freebirds for the World Six-Man Tag Team titles for World Class Championship Wrestling. Plus, they had other matches. They had the Junkyard Dog coming in from Mid-South Wrestling to beat the Missing Link. They had the Super Destroyers, who were Scott and Bill Irwin, face off against Iceman King Parsons and Rock and Roll Zumhoff. They also had Chris Adams and Sunshine against Jimmy Garvin and Precious in a mixed tag team match. They had the Hacksaw Bush Reed from Mid-South Wrestling wrestled Chick Donovan, and they had a few other cards. This was the peak of world-class championship wrestling, the David Von Erich Memorial Championship card in 1984. Afterwards, Kerry Von Erich was only NWA champion for 18 days. He dropped it to Ric Flair in a tour of Japan. The Freebirds eventually left World Class Championship Wrestling to go to the WWE and Championship Wrestling from Florida, but they would shuffle back and forth between territories for the next couple of years. They didn't stay in World Class Championship Wrestling that much. They went to AWA and other territories as well. In order to fill the void for heels for the Von Erichs, they had Gentleman Chris Adams turn on the Von Erichs because Adams was a close friend to the Von Erichs, and they teamed him with Gino Hernandez, and the dynamic duo feuded with the Von Erichs for many months in 1985. The feud was very, very hot. It was probably as hot as the Freebirds feud. The dynamic duo of Gentleman Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez had the Playboy Gary Hart as their manager. They briefly added Jake the Snake Roberts to their faction, but Jake the Snake was in between runs with Mid-South Wrestling. So after a few months, Jake the Snake went back to Mid-South Wrestling. They also had One Man Gang come into the World Class Championship Wrestling around this time. They also had Billy Jack Haynes. They had a great tag team feud with the Fantastics and the Midnight Express around this time in 1985. The Midnight Express were Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton, and they had Jim Cornette in their manager. For 6 months, the Fantastics and Midnight Express had an awesome feud, but the Midnight Express left World Class Championship Wrestling because they wanted to feud with the Von Erichs, and the Von Erichs did not want to feud with the Midnight Express, but the Midnight Express went to Jim Crockett Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Also around this time, in the summer of 1985, World Class Championship Wrestling traveled to other parts of the country. They went to Boston. They had a couple of shows at the old Manning Bowl in Lynn, Massachusetts, which drew pretty good because they were syndicated around there on Fox 25. They went to other places, which they do a decent amount, and also World Class Championship Wrestling went to the Middle East, Israel, around 1985, but a tragic kind of a disaster happened in Israel. During a tag team match, Mike Von Erich got injured, and then he suffered toxic shock syndrome, which his body temperature went to 106 degrees. He was really in death's bed, and Mike Von Erich was not the same. He lost considerable amounts of weight and stuff. And also 1985, they had the David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions, which was a decent show, about 25,000. The main event was the Freebirds teaming with Kevin and Kerry to face off against Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez and Kamala and Dr. Death in one-man gang. And that drew 25,000, and they also had Ric Flair on the card defending against Kevin Von Erich. Kevin Von Erich did double duty for the David Von Erich Parade Memorial of Champions. In 1985 was a banner year for World Class Championship Wrestling, but that was the peak of World Class Championship Wrestling. So many changes happened beginning in 1986. First change was Jim Crockett became more powerful in the NWA. He eventually controlled the NWA champion Ric Flair, and his first order of business in 1986, he was not going to allow Ric Flair or any NWA star to go to any NWA affiliated territory that was part of the NWA, because he wanted Ric Flair to be exclusively booked in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. And the World Class Championship Wrestling did not like that. They succeeded from the NWA, and they formed their own world champion. They actually called it the World Class Wrestling Alliance Championship. But for all intensive purposes, it was World Class Championship Wrestling to the fans. Also, another tragedy happened in 1986 for World Class Championship Wrestling. Gino Hernandez, who was one of the biggest heels in the company, suddenly passed away at the age of 28. Gino Hernandez was going to feud with his former tag team partner Chris Adams, but the feud never got going because of Gino Hernandez's untimely death. Also, around the spring of 1986, there was a talent raid of World Class Championship Wrestling stars. Ken Mantell, who was the booker for World Class Championship Wrestling for many years, took a position to become booker with Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling, which was at the time being rebranded as Universal Wrestling Federation, and they were going to expand nationwide to compete with the WWE and NWA Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. And Ken Mantell took most of World Class Championship Wrestling talent, including the Freebirds, Missing Link, John Tatum, Jack Victory, Missy Hyatt, Sunshine, Iceman King Parsons, Chris Adams, and Scandal Akbar, and so many others. And it left World Class Championship Wrestling in serious trouble. To conquer that, World Class Championship Wrestling brought in talent like Ravishing Rick Rude. They also brought in Percy Pringle, who is known as Paul Bearer in the WWE. They also brought in Mad Dog Bud Sawyer, Maniac Matt Bourne. They brought in Scott, Steve, and Sean Simpson, who were from South Africa. They brought in Blackjack Mulligan. They also brought in Mr. USA Tony Atlas, and they brought in a wrestler who was called The Rock, part of the Blade Runners, with Sting in Mid-South, and they renamed The Rock the Dingo Warrior, and they brought in a few other talents and stuff, which that was pretty good. But the house shows in the World Class Championship Wrestling territory was suffering because they didn't have Ric Flair or any other big NWA name and stuff. And even though the Von Erichs were still a draw, that house show attendance was plummeting and stuff like that. But in June of 1986, probably the biggest blow to World Class Championship Wrestling, Kerry Von Erich, who was the biggest star in World Class Championship Wrestling, suffered a motorcycle accident that severely broke his foot. eventually Kerry Von Erich had to get that foot amputated and wrestle his rest of his life with a prosthesis and stuff like that. And Kevin Von Erich had to go on television every month or so saying that Kerry was injured, but it's not serious, he'll be back in a month or so. But when that month came up, Kevin had to say that again and again, because if they said he was going to be out a year, the fans would turn off of World Class Championship Wrestling and wouldn't come back. And it would also cause, you know, fans didn't want that. Plus, also World Class Championship Wrestling was out of heels, big time heels, and they had to like create a new heel. They created Brian Adidas, who was in real life Kerry Von Erich's best friend. Brian Adidas was like kind of a jobber wrestler, a mid-card wrestler who was a face. They teamed them up with Al Madrid, who was actually a Texas independent wrestler who wrestled many years in regional territories in Texas and stuff. And they had to call them the New Dynamic Duels. And with Kerry on the shelf, they had to bring in another Von Erich called Lance Von Erich, who was a independent wrestler who wrestled in Portland, Oregon by the name of Ricky Vaughn. They called him Lance Von Erich, and he was the first cousin to the rest of the Von Erichs, and he was the son of Waldo Von Erich, who was brothers to Fritz Von Erich. In real life, Fritz Von Erich and Waldo Von Erich were not related, and people did not buy Lance Von Erich as a Von Erich. He teamed with Kevin and Mike to feud with Brian Adidas and like Al Madrid, but the crowds were not coming to that. And also, once in a while, Fritz Von Erich would come out of retirement and wrestle the heels, but he looked very out of shape and stuff like that. And plus, around this time, they had Bruiser Brody have a feud with Abdullah the Butcher, but that didn't last too long because both Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher were wrestlers who would go from territory to territory to territory. They wouldn't stay that long. And finally, in late 1986, Kerry Von Erich returned to the ring after 6 months out of commission of wrestling. And Kerry Von Erich wasn't the same wrestler ever at all. He looked very horrible, but, you know, World Class Championship Wrestling was like losing big time money, and I think it was Fritz who really wanted Kerry to wrestle again, because just to save his territory. In 1987, another Von Erich tragedy hit. Mike Von Erich took his own life at the age of 23. He recovered from toxic shock syndrome okay, but he was not the same wrestler. He looked very weak. There was reports he was only 150 pounds wrestling, and that's not good when you're wrestling two guys who are 200, 250 pounds and stuff. It was awful. And also the talent raids happened to take World Class Championship Wrestling. Rick Rude went to Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions. The Dingo Warrior got scooped up by the WWE to become the Ultimate Warrior. Like Tony Atlas did not no-showed several cards, and he got fired. They tried to bring in Bam Bam Bigelow, used his name as Crusher Yushkov from Russia, but that didn't work. They brought in some local talent that wrestled in Texas, but the fans weren't coming, and the attendance at the Sportatorium and at the Will Rogers Arena and a couple of other venues at World Class were dropping down like flies. They were wrestling to have empty arenas. Many of these fans just went to the monthly or bi-monthly show of the WWE and NWA in Dallas and other stuff like that. And also the David Memorial Parade of Champions was like the attendance there went from like 25,000 in 1985 to about 10,000 in 1986, 5,000 in 1987, and only about 3,000 in 1988 at Texas Stadium where the Cowboys played, and it was just horrible. It was horrible. World Class Championship Wrestling was losing millions of dollars, plus it was being dropped by many affiliates. The show was. They were dropped in major markets. Eventually they went to ESPN. They showed a weekly show on ESPN. Plus, they got some syndicated markets back, but they were on low-budgeted stations or very late at night. And by the winter of 1987 into 1988, World Class Championship Wrestling was on the verge of collapse. But Fritz von Erich had a plan to try to save World Class Championship Wrestling by creating the angle where he gets attacked by the fabulous Freebirds, the new ones, who were Terry Bam Bam Gordy and Buddy Jack Roberts. They didn't have Michael Hayes because he was wrestling for Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett at the time. And they recruited the Angel of Death and Iceman King Parsons, who was a face. They turned him heel, and they faced off against, they attacked Kerry Von Erich at the Christmas show at the Reunion Arena in Dallas, Texas, which they would always have big shows at Thanksgiving and Christmas there. And Kerry Von Erich was supposed to wrestle Al Perez for the World Class Championship Wrestling world title, but there was, Fritz Von Erich was attacked and stuff by the Freebirds and stuff. And afterwards, Kevin and Kerry had to help Fritz Von Erich out of the ring, and Fritz Von Erich collapsed, and he suffered a heart attack. And the Dallas media kind of reported that Fritz Von Erich passed away of a heart attack at the age of 58, but everybody knew better. This was a wrestling angle, and Fritz Von Erich really wanted to save World Class Championship Wrestling. But behind the scenes, Fritz Von Erich was getting out of the wrestling business because of the deaths of David Von Erich and Mike Von Erich, and he lost interest in wrestling after Mike Von Erich passed away. And every single week for the next 6 months, Fritz Von Erich, they would have health updates on health updates of Fritz Von Erich's condition on World Class Championship Wrestling programs at the house, at the Sportatorium, at the Will Rogers Arena were like healthy, were great. They said Fritz was getting better, and they were saying he's on the verge of going into rehab. But if the crowds at the Sportatorium or the Will Rogers Arena was down, they said Fritz Von Erich was on his deathbed, and he could have his last rites with him. This angle ran its course within a few months. Eventually, Fritz Von Erich sold controlling interest to World Class Championship Wrestling to Johnny Mantell, and Fritz Von Erich was out of the wrestling business. And the Freebirds versus Von Erich feud in 1988 was okay, but it wasn't magical. Eventually, the Lance Von Erich experiment failed because he wasn't really a Von Erich. He jumped to a rival promotion, and Fritz Von Erich said on television he's not a Von Erich. And he went for legal rights, not for like Lance Von Erich, not to be called Lance Von Erich in any other territorial wrestling organization. And World Class Championship Wrestling was continuing to survive on a thread. They entered a working relationship with the CWA out of Memphis, Tennessee, Jerry Jarrett, and they had a talent exchange. They had wrestlers such as Jerry the King Lawler, Jeff Jarrett, Dutch Mantell, and superstar Bill Dundee wrestle for World Class Championship Wrestling, and all of them were heels in Texas while they were wrestling for World Class Championship Wrestling. And this was a good working relationship for a while. And they also developed a working relationship with the AWA of all territories, which was run by Vern Kanya. CWA, AWA, and WCCW were going to promote a pay-per-view called Super Clash 3, which was going to be held in Chicago, Illinois on December 13th, 1988, with the main event Jerry the King Lawler against Kerry Von Erich for they were going to unify the AWA World Title and the WCCW World Title. But this pay-per-view card was awful. The main event had Kerry Von Erich bleed. against with Lawler. He was putting the iron claw on him. The referee laying the belt. People thought Kerry was the new unified world champion, but the referee had to call excessive blood. It was awful and stuff. People were booing. The crowd in Chicago only was 2,000, and the pay-per-view revenues was only about $25,000, and Verne Gagne stiffed everybody. And also, World Class Championship Wrestling was really needing these revenues to stay afloat and stuff like that. And they couldn't, if they didn't get the revenue, so they were having financial troubles. And Johnny Mantell worked out an agreement with Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler to buy World Class Championship Wrestling, including the ESPN time slot. But they could not get the World Class Championship Wrestling name because that was owned by Fritz von Erich and the von Erich family, and he was not going to sell the rights to World Class Championship Wrestling to him. And they came up with an angle with Eric Embry, the flamboyant one, who was a heel in the CWA. He came down to World Class Championship Wrestling and became a face. And Eric Embry feuded with Devastation Incorporated, held it by Scandal Akbar, and Devastation Incorporated at this time was Black Bart and Cactus Jack, who's Mick Foley, Gorgeous Gallion, and other wrestlers. And actually, Eric Embry lost a loser's leave WCW match to Devastation Incorporated, but Percy Pringle, who was a heel manager, actually became a face commentator with Mark Lorenz, and Percy Pringle tried to get Eric Embry reinstated, and this was a big angle and stuff, and the houses were being, at the Sportatorium and across the territory were going up and up and up and up. And this is also about the time when the deal closed, when Jerry Jarrett bought the rights to that's World Class from Fritz von Erich, and they had a famous match with Eric Embry against P.Y. Chinhai, was actually a wrestler from CWA called Phil Hickinson. P.Y. Chinhai was claiming he was from Japan. He was with Scandal Akbar, and the stipulation is if P.Y. Chinhai won, Scandal Akbar would take over control of World Class Championship Wrestling. But if Eric Embry won, they would take over World Class Championship Wrestling, and it would change it to the USWA. Eric Embry won the match against P.Y. Chinhai in August of 1989, and the last match for World Class Championship Wrestling. After the match, Eric Embry and Percy Pringle ripped down the sign of World Class Championship Wrestling. World Class Championship Wrestling was no more. It was the USWA, and it was an end to a great era in professional wrestling when World Class Championship Wrestling was probably the hottest regional territory in the 1980s and stuff. And it should have expanded nationwide and stuff, but Fritz von Erich really did not want to go nationwide because he was friends with several of the promoters in different territories like Verne Gagne and Jim Crockett and Eddie Graham. But at the end, it kind of killed him because Jim Crockett got power for the NWA, and he stopped sending Ric Flair and other NWA stars to promote the Sportatorium cards and stuff like that. Plus the tragedies of David Von Erich and Mike Von Erich, which were very sad. Eventually, Kerry Von Erich and Chris Von Erich passed away as well. Chris Von Erich tried to wrestle for about a year in the USWA, but he was only 5'5" and suffered from asthma, and he took his life in 1991. Kerry Von Erich went to the WWE. He had a short reign as Intercontinental Champion, but it didn't last too long. Eventually, he passed away by committing suicide in 1993 at the age of 33. And also World Class Championship Wrestling, a lot of the stars, including Terry Bam Bam Gordy of the Fabulous Freebirds, passed away young at the age of 40 in 2001. gentleman clip. Chris Adams passed away at the age of 45 in October of 2001. And a lot of other wrestlers who wrestled in World Class Championship Wrestling passed away very early. It was a feel-good territory, but in the end, it just turned out to be a sad wrestling tragedy. And, you know, Fritz von Erich lost 5 of his 6 sons. That's awful for a father to go through, burying your kids before you do. After, like, Kerry von Erich passed away, his wife, Doris, of over 42 years, left him. And in 1997, Fritz von Erich passed away at the age of 68 of brain cancer. And the WWE and WCW did not acknowledge his death on television, which is even more sad because Fritz von Erich was a legend in professional wrestling. He was innovating and stuff like that. World Class Championship Wrestling was an innovative company. It probably could have been still been around if David von Erich did not pass away in early 1984, because I believe that David von Erich was the best wrestler in World Class Championship Wrestling. He had so much charisma, in my opinion. Everybody liked working with him, including the fabulous Freebirds and stuff like that. Kerry von Erich was a great wrestler. He had the charisma, but, you know, there was something, when I watch matches of Kerry now, there was something, it was okay, but the focus of him, he was heavily into drugs and stuff like that. And also watching, like, Mike von Erich, he really did not really want to become a wrestler and stuff like that, but I think maybe Fritz wanted something like that. And Kevin was a good wrestler and stuff, and the Freebirds were amazing. Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez were great. Gary Hart and Scandal Akbar were great heel managers, and the cast of characters of World Class Championship Wrestling. The rights to World Class Championship Wrestling are owned by WWE, and they had a couple of DVDs about World Class Championship Wrestling. One was produced by the WWE that came out in 2007. There was one that was produced in 2006. The documentaries that are pretty good. World Class Championship Wrestling is on the WWE network, and so it's a good show. And they have this. They used to have this theme song. Do 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 do. That's it. Well, I'll be back for the third and final video blog of the night in a while. It will be about former NHL player and Hockey Hall of Famer center Adam Oates, who played for the Bruins for about 5 seasons, and he's now the co-coach of the New Jersey Devils. See you later, everybody.